Good evening, everyone. Good evening and welcome to the Trinity Forum's Evening Conversation tonight with Michael Lindsay on View from the Top, an inside look at how people in power see and shape the world. We are thrilled by the turnout tonight, and if you are still standing, there are a few seats right over here, one or two right there as well, so feel free to make your way to a spot where you can actually sit comfortably for the rest of the evening. I'm Cherie Harder, the president of the Trinity Forum, and we are really excited to partner with Gordon this evening in hosting tonight's presentation. I'd like to thank Gordon's board and staff for their willingness to partner with us, and I'm delighted that we're joined tonight by a few trustees from Gordon, including Susie Young and Santiago Sadaka, as well as Trinity Forum board members Ann Holliday and Bob Kramer, advisory board member Peter McDonald, and Trinity Forum Academy trustees Hardy and Carolyn Gardner. I'm also delighted that so many Trinity Forum Academy alumni and Gordon alumni are here tonight, so we're delighted that you're here. And finally, we're excited that each and every one of you are here this evening. We think that you're going to find this discussion very compelling, and since there's not enough time to answer all of the audience questions, we do want to let you know that we'll be live blogging this event so you can follow along on social media, either on our Facebook page or on Twitter, using hashtag Trinity Forum or hashtag View from the Top. And in addition to being broadcast live tonight on C-SPAN 2, tonight's presentation is also going to run throughout the weekend on C-SPAN's Book TV. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Trinity Forum, we provide a space and resources for leaders to engage life's greatest questions in the context of faith. We believe that ideas have consequences, and that part of the Christian mandate of loving God with all of your mind requires thoughtful contemplation of the great ideas and questions of our time. And so it is our mission and our joy to provide publications and programs such as the one tonight to help leaders engage those big questions and ultimately to come to better know the author of the answers. It's been said that the great questions of life essentially boil down to just three. What is a good person? What is the good life? And what is a just society? And our conceptions of and hopes for all three of those questions are necessarily influenced, at least in part, by the individuals' institutions that shape our lives. And so grappling with those great questions ushers in another line of inquiry. What is the nature of good leadership? Is it possible to both live and lead wisely and well? It's a question of enormous importance, and perhaps particularly in our time, when public trust in leaders in business, government, and virtually every institution has plummeted to new lows in the wake of leadership failures. As the supply of trustworthy leaders seems ever more elusive, the need to understand how to cultivate and develop such leadership is more urgent. And few can address that need with the expertise or the insight as our speaker this evening, Dr. Michael Lindsay. Michael is a prominent sociologist, author, and the president of Gordon College, located outside of Boston, Massachusetts. A summa cum laude graduate of Baylor with theology degrees from Princeton and Wycliffe Hall at Oxford, as well as a PhD in sociology from Princeton, Michael has devoted much of his academic career to the study of leadership. As a professor at Rice University, he directed the program for the study of leadership there, as well as published his Pulitzer Prize-nominated book, Faith in the Halls of Power, which was listed as a best book of 2007 by Publishers Weekly and was widely profiled in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, CNN, and countless other outlets. Since assuming the presidency of Gordon, Michael's leadership expertise has become increasingly practical as well as academic. His relatively short tenure there has been accompanied not only by a dramatic increase in applications, enrollments, and donations, for which I'm sure your trustees thank you, but also a new emphasis on developing and inspiring a new generation of leaders. Towards that end, he has developed and introduced two new programs, including the Gordon Presidential Fellows Program, which is modeled after the White House Fellows Programs, and the Elevate Program, what he calls a week-long leadership lab. He has also just completed the largest ever interview-based study of leaders, the results of which he details in his newest book, View from the Top, which we've invited him to discuss here today. At the conclusion of Michael's remarks, he'll be joined on stage by his co-author, Mary Grace Hager, who I am very proud to say is an alumnus of the Trinity Forum Academy. We're very proud to claim her. And together, they'll take audience questions. Michael, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Cherie. I wish my folks were here. My dad would be so proud, and my mom would actually believe it, what you said. Tonight, I want to share with you what I've spent the last 10 years of my life focused on, trying to understand what makes great leaders. What are the motivations that draw them to assume positions of responsibility? How do they manage the challenges and opportunities that they encounter within their positions of responsibility? And how do they seek to create a legacy that extends far beyond their term in office? A lot of people ask me, how in the world did you get a chance to interview 550 amazing individuals? It was a wonderful project. It started out as my dissertation at Princeton, so I'm living proof that you can write a dissertation that your wife will describe as actually interesting. But so much of getting the interviews is a matter of being in the right place at the right time. I was out in Silicon Valley conducting some interviews and had a couple hours to kill, so I went to the bookstore at Stanford University. I had been in the store for a couple of minutes, and I looked over in the corner of my eye and saw a woman who I had been trying to track down for years. A woman who looked exactly like Karen Hughes. Now, you remember Karen Hughes. She served as counselor to the president for George W. Bush. I had been trying to get an interview with Karen Hughes for about 4 years, and here she was, or so I thought, in the flesh. I wasn't positive it was Karen Hughes, so I decided I needed to wait until she spoke. So I just sort of eased up beside this woman, and in a couple of minutes she said something, and I instantly recognized that raspy Texan voice and thought, this is my big break. And then I realized, I have never asked somebody for an interview face to face. It's sort of like asking somebody out on a date face to face. What if they say no? Then it's embarrassing. So I needed to get my nerve up. So I decided I'll just sort of circle around Karen Hughes, which I did. I got to the end of the first circle and decided I'm not ready to do this, so I'll circle a second time. I actually circled around Karen Hughes a third time, a fourth. I circled around Karen Hughes 5 times at the Stanford bookstore. At the end of the 5th cycle, I decided this is too nerve-wracking. I'm out of here, and I left the store. Now, there's a large plaza outside of the bookstore at Stanford, and I stand out there and I'm thinking, now, God, what was that all about? Why was I so intimidated and so concerned what she would think of me? So what if she says no? She'll forget it in 5 minutes. I'll remember it the rest of my life. So I decided I'd go back into the bookstore, and I go back in looking for Karen Hughes, and I can't find her. I thought, well, this is divine punishment. I didn't have the courage early on. Eventually, I noticed she's on the 2nd floor at the coffee bar. So I start walking up, and as I'm walking up the stairs, I'm thinking, now how do I address her? Do I call her Madam Counselor or Counselor Hughes? Mrs. Hughes? Hey, Karen? What am I supposed to say? I still was sorting that out in my mind as I reached her, and I didn't know what to say, so I just tapped her on the shoulder. She turned around, and I have this habit when I get nervous of having red splotches appear on my neck. And I knew I had about 60 seconds before my face would be beet red. So I said, Mrs. Hughes, my name is Michael Lindsay. I'm a sociologist conducting a study on leaders. I wonder if you might be willing to give me an interview. She said, well, actually, I'm out here looking at colleges with my son, so this is not a good time. But I'll give you my phone number, and you can call me in a couple of months. I'd be happy to sit down with you. I took her number, and a couple of months passed, and I gave her a call. I said, Mrs. Hughes, I don't know if you remember me. My name is Michael Lindsay. She said, oh, yes, the young man who turned bright red at Stanford. I said, yes, ma'am, that's me. She ended up giving me an interview. We did it at the Hay Adams Hotel right across the street from the White House. And it was an amazing interview. Because here's a woman who really was as surprised as anyone that she was in the inner circle of political power. She had not spent her life trying to get there. She happened to be good friends with a man who ran for president. He ended up winning, and he invited her to come and work with him. Once she was in that office, however, she began to wonder, is this how I want to lead my life? She was working crazy hours, had a teenage son, she was never seeing him, and if you know her story, she ended up resigning her position at the White House, moving back to Austin, and it was at that time that I conducted the interview with her. She was grappling with the questions about vocation and calling, responsibility and influence, and she ended up deciding to go back to Washington, worked in the State Department for a couple of years. She represents in miniature what I found across these 550 people I was blessed to get a chance to meet. Extraordinary individuals, each of whom have their own stories, that had interesting things to offer as we try to understand how does leadership work in our culture today. I wrote View from the Top with a hope that it would inspire the next generation of leaders. It's a book that if you are in a position of responsibility, I think you'll find it resonates with some of your experience. A lot of the people that I've interviewed have picked up copies and sent me some emails, and they're not all hate emails, so I take that as a good sign. What we tried to do in the story is to represent people's experiences as truthfully and as honestly as we could, and at the same time, apply the critical analysis skills of a social scientist. We tell stories of numbers, big numbers of folks who are represented in the study, but also their individual experiences and journeys. There are 4 things that I thought might be helpful tonight to share that I walk away from the study after 10 years thinking is really important. One is the significance of what we call institutional leadership. George Heilmeyer is an extraordinary man, an engineer who grew up not too far away from the University of Pennsylvania. His parents were immigrants to this country. He didn't have a lot of money. His dad actually was a janitor. But he went to college, studied engineering, and then got a job working for RCA. While he was an engineer there, he actually discovered the technology that would allow liquid crystal displays, something that we use today. The problem, however, is that George discovered this in 1964, and the leadership at RCA wasn't convinced it was all that interesting. And so while he tried to persuade his colleagues, in the end he wasn't successful. And the US lost its competitive advantage. It was the Japanese who brought liquid crystal displays to the marketplace in the 1970s and 80s. You see, George is an extraordinary individual, but without institutional backing, he wasn't able to make a long-term difference that changed human history. He still gets the credit for coming up with the invention, but most people don't even know his name. Institutions matter far more than I expected starting this study. I thought interviewing 550 people, I'd really be studying about extraordinary personalities, people who have a certain persona. Actually, what I found is that most of the power in our culture is housed within institutions. And so if you don't have that sort of inside connection in a leadership position with an institution, you have little chance of making a long-term impact on culture. One extraordinary person I met is named Marty Evans. She was the first female Rear Admiral in the US Navy. She went on to serve as the head of the American Red Cross, the commissioner of the Ladies Professional Golf Association, been on a number of corporate boards. But you remember the tailhook incident that happened in the US Navy in the 1990s. It was an embarrassing situation where there was clear gender bias that was occurring within the military. Marty was the person who was tasked with leading the task force that would help the US Navy figure out how could you create more space for women to serve in combat or in leadership positions in the US Navy. Because she was an insider at that institution, she was able to bring about a significant change to the US military. One of the key lessons that I tell my students at Gordon is that if you want to have a lasting impact, you've got to be in the room where decisions are made. That's why institutional leadership matters. The second key element of leadership that we encountered over the course of this study is the value of early leadership. Here's the interesting thing. We found that it really doesn't matter much about what you do before age 20. There's no statistically significant relationship between virtually any variable you could imagine and the likelihood of becoming a strategic leader later in life. It doesn't matter if your parents were rich or poor. It doesn't matter if you were a varsity athlete or if you were a student body president. It doesn't matter if you were popular or a nerd. None of those things really matter. What does matter, however, is that sometime in the early adult stage, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, in the college years in particular, you need to find a mentor. Somebody who will help raise the opportunities for you, who will introduce you to different networks. There's a wonderful social scientist named Mark Granovetter. He wrote a book in the 1970s called Getting a Job. The key finding from his research was that it doesn't really matter if your family and friends help you make connections when you're applying for jobs, because they really don't have a long-term impact. Instead, he discovered what he calls the strength of weak ties. We get jobs because of acquaintance networks, friends of friends who help make introductions that give us opportunities. And in fact, that's what I found over the course of my study. Many of the folks who got a leg up in the world achieved that because they were a friend of a friend who made an introduction. One of the key findings of the study is that young people have to learn how to maximize the opportunities that they're given. Not everybody has the same repertoire of skills or talents, but you use what you're given to the maximum potential. A wonderful story. Kevin Plank was a football player at the University of Maryland. Kevin wasn't the best student in school. He also wasn't the best athlete. A number of his friends were getting drafted for the NFL, and he didn't really have his sights on that because he didn't think it was going to be a possibility. But Kevin had always been good at sales. He ran in college a flower service where guys could buy roses for their girlfriends on Valentine's Day. He ran it out of his dorm room and made a lot of money. So he knew he could sell things. One day, at the end of the practices, the two-a-day practices he was having in late August, I think it was of his senior year, he realized as he took his shoulder pads off that his t-shirt was just weighted down with sweat. And he thought, there's got to be a way in which you could invent a fabric that could somehow wick away the moisture so that you would not have this 5-10 pounds you were carrying when you're trying to perform as an athlete. He literally invented the industry of performance apparel. He took his last $600 while he was sleeping on the couch at his grandmother's house, invested in 6 different fibers, trying to see if this would be the key, and it ended up working. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was the start of Under Armour. You never know how you take opportunities and backgrounds and experiences that you've got, maximize them and leverage them to be able to have a lasting impact. Early leadership, we found, makes a huge difference. You have to experience what we call in the book a leadership catalyst. When I was a faculty member at Rice, we were trying to figure out how could Rice enter into the top 10 institutions nationally ranked. Rice is a wonderful school. It's been number 16, 17, 18 for a number of years, and they wanted to go to the next level. One of the areas that they thought they might invest in was a rigorous leadership development program that would help elevate the contributions of the young people who they were serving. So I was tasked with the opportunity to go and look at all the leadership development programs that were being run in universities, in the private sector, public sector, and see what was working really effectively. I looked at about 25 that had a lot of promise and actually concluded that there was one that was very significant. It's called the White House Fellowship. It was started in 1964 by President Johnson. It's a program where folks who are in their 20s, who are promising emerging leaders, resign whatever job they have at that time, move to Washington, and come to work for a U.S. Cabinet Secretary for 1 year. In that role, they're given a chance to see up close, how does leadership really work? And then they take that experience back with them to their respective jobs. The idea, according to President Johnson, is that this would raise the leadership quotient of those folks who would go on to occupy senior leadership roles in commerce, technology, entertainment, and government, not just over the next 10 years, but the next 50 years. It's been amazingly significant. As it turned out, I was able to be involved in the selection process for 1 year, and this is when I became convinced this is extraordinary. I was sitting across the table from a guy who holds an endowed chair of surgery at Johns Hopkins Medical School. He wrote a textbook that's used in 40% of the medical schools around the country, and he's a regular contributor to CNN. He got rejected for the White House Fellowship. I decided if that's what the rejects look like, I got to study this program. And it's actually wonderful because some years there'll be as many as 2,000 or 3,000 people who will apply for the White House Fellowship, and they'll narrow it down to 30 national finalists. I got to tell you, when you take a pool of 3,000 and narrow it down to 30, it's really hard to tell who should be selected and who shouldn't. And because I was on the inside track, I could tell you there was a lot of things that were idiosyncratic. Did a particular candidate tell a joke that the judges liked? Did they make a particular connection with somebody else? You can't tell these folks apart in meaningful ways at that point. But then if you follow their career trajectories, something emerges. We found, for example, that among those folks who were finalists for the White House Fellowship, but not actually selected to be a fellow, 12% of them go on to be a very senior leader, to be a CEO of a Fortune 1000 company, or hold a similar position of leadership in their own field, whether it be medicine or law, entertainment, or education. 12%, that's not bad. But if you compare that with those folks who were not just finalists for the program, but actual White House fellows, you see that over the course of their career, 32% of them go on to hold that position. At one moment, you can't tell these folks apart. At another moment, this one group is 2.5 times more likely to assume the pinnacle of leadership in our society. So we went about to try and study what made that program work. I interviewed about 100 former White House fellows, folks like Colin Powell, Wesley Clark, the CEO of Levi Strauss, of JCPenney, extraordinary individuals. We did a survey of them, got an 82% response rate, really had an amazing experience. And then I went about the process of building a leadership development program modeled on the White House Fellowship for college students. In the midst of that, I was invited to assume the presidency at Gordon, and so I'll never forget my conversation with Rice's president when I went in to tell him I was moving to Gordon. He was very nice. He said, "Michael, we're really excited about you, but I do have a question. Whose intellectual property is that study you did?" I said, "Well, David, I think it's part of my research." And he said, "Yeah, I was afraid you were going to say that." So I brought it to Gordon, and we built a program called the Gordon Presidential Fellows Program. It's the only program in the country that's modeled on the White House Fellowship for college students. We believe deeply in the importance of early leadership opportunities. My research found that it makes a significant difference. It doesn't matter a lot what happens before about age 20, but between 20 and 40, that's a significant season, because it's when people who have a particular upward trajectory have the opportunity to significantly sharpen the angle of their trajectory and go on to assume significant positions of responsibility in their chosen vocation. So in addition to institutional leadership and early leadership, we also saw the value of what we call symbolic leadership. It's interesting because I did not realize how much leadership depends on your ability to really lead with your life. So much of what a leader does is measured by how they represent themselves in public, how much they embody the values and the virtues of the institutions of which they're a part. And it's interesting because some people who are incredibly thoughtful realize that even when you're trying to be very careful in how you represent your values and your ideals, you can't always predict how it'll be interpreted. A wonderful story of this is I interviewed Condoleezza Rice. You know, an amazing woman, concert pianist, Soviet expert, youngest provost at Stanford University, national security advisor, and Secretary of State. Meeting her was an extraordinary opportunity, and as we were conducting the interview, I asked her about missteps she had made while in the White House, and what did she learn from that. She said, "I learned that your life is a symbol, and people pay attention to symbols." I said, "What does that mean?" She said, "Do you remember when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans?" I did. She said, "I was serving as Secretary of State at the time. Now, as Secretary of State, I had nothing to do with FEMA or the U.S. government's response to what was happening in New Orleans. It was as far removed as you could possibly be. And as it turned out, I was in New York for the opening of the General Assembly of the United Nations, as the Secretary of State should do. I realized that I had not packed an appropriate dress for a reception I was going to that evening. And my staff said they'd be happy to go out and get me one. And I said, no, actually, I've got a spare hour. I'll just run into the store to do it. So she took a spare hour, ran to Saks Fifth Avenue to get a dress, picked out a dress that was perfectly appropriate, and then hopped in a cab to get back to the UN. But as it turned out, when you're Secretary of State, you were being watched all the time. And a reporter snapped a picture of Dr. Rice walking out of Saks Fifth Avenue with a shopping bag on the same day that there was a picture of the devastation happening in New Orleans. And she said, I realized you have to lead with your life. The fourth approach to leadership that we encountered that we think differentiates folks is what we call platinum leadership. I interviewed 550 amazing people, folks who have done extraordinary things. But within that 550, we found that there were 22% of them, or about 120 individuals, who had done the extraordinary. They not only were leading an institution that had national or global scope, but they also had been able to maximize the opportunities that came to them in that role, and at the same time, garner the trust and respect of their colleagues and their peers. Incredibly hard to do in a competitive environment. These platinum leaders, we found, really stood apart from other folks. They had the ability to combine the institutional leadership that we talked about and the symbolic leadership. They recognized that they could do extraordinary things. And so they were individuals who I particularly liked, enjoyed getting to know them, because they had a compelling sort of winsome persona about how they carried their values with them to take wider effect. As it turns out, one of the individuals who really impressed me was a senior vice president of Continental Airlines in the late 1990s. His name is David Grizzle. In the 1990s, the airline industry was trying to figure out new ways to recognize revenue opportunities. And David was able to broker a landmark deal that really changed the entire airline industry. He brokered a deal with one of Continental's competitors, Northwest Airlines, where they would sell seats on each other's planes, where they would recognize reciprocal benefits for their frequent flyers. This is what laid the groundwork for all the consolidation we've seen in the airline industry over the last 10 years. It started in the late 1990s. It was wildly successful, and as a result, Wall Street loved the story, and the stock price of Continental went through the roof. Because of that, David was entitled as a senior executive to a nice end-of-year bonus, as was the entire executive team. But you see, David and his wife, Ann, are people of deep faith who want to make sure that their life is commensurate with their values. And so they have made a decision that they would live beneath their means. They wouldn't always buy the fanciest car. They wouldn't always live in the biggest house. And David realized that, if this end-of-year bonus, which is a lot of money, comes to me, we really want to give it away. They were particularly wanting to give it away to a charity called World Vision. But if it comes to him, it's going to get taxed, and so there'll be less money that's able to go to that particular organization. And so he went and approached the general counsel at Continental to see if he could possibly give back his bonus, and if that money could be directed through Continental's corporate philanthropy to the charitable organization of his choice. Well, the lawyer had never heard of an executive who wanted to give back their bonus. They had to check the law books to see if this could actually pass muster. But sure enough, it was possible. And here's the extraordinary thing. David then had the opportunity to use that experience to garner moral authority. And because of that, he went around and knocked on the doors of all the other executives who were going to get bonuses that year. And they all knew that the stock price had gone up because of what David had done. And he went and said, Cherie, you really don't need that $1 million, do you? Wouldn't it be great for us to be able to do something extraordinary? And in the end, David was able to use that moral authority to be able to persuade his colleagues to donate a lot more money through Continental's corporate philanthropy. They looked good, the company looked good, and they did a lot of good. Now, it's not every day that you get to tell a story about one of your interviewees who happens to be in the room. But tonight, I'm very blessed because David Grizzle is here. And David, I salute you. I've had the great pleasure to meet some extraordinary people like David who have made a difference to their given responsibilities and roles. In the book, we say that the key thing that a leader needs to do if they're going to be a leader over the long haul in 2014 is that they have to think institutionally but act personally. We lead, friends, with our lives. That's how you lead in a way that not only builds up your organization, but also serves the common good. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michael, and there'll be an opportunity for audience questions. Elias Brockman will be here with a microphone. Elias, there he is. If you could stand and wait for Elias to get to you, that would be great. But before we do that, I want to introduce Michael's co-author of View from the Top, Mary Grace Hager, who mentioned briefly earlier. Mary Grace serves as special assistant to President Lindsay. She graduated from Rice in 2010. She is an alumnus of the Trinity Forum Academy, which I'm delighted to say. And I know, Mary Grace, you have been very involved in a lot of the both quantitative and qualitative analysis from View for the Top. And since you are one of those 20-somethings that Michael has talked about quite a bit in his book, I'd like to start out the question by a question to you, which is, what is your takeaway as a 20-something on that journey of a proto-leader? And from the analysis, what did you kind of call an application to your own life?
Thank you. I started working with research in college, and I remember my senior year, I was especially working on a project with the Rhodes Scholars, and I would spend all day reading the American Oxonian, their journal, and thinking about Rhodes Scholars, and I felt so discouraged because I was not going to be a Rhodes Scholar, and I thought, is this really the only path to leadership? This is the only path to success? And kind of in these next couple of years, as we've done more research in the book, I've kind of realized that it helps to be a Rhodes Scholar. It helps to come from a family with resources, but it's not necessary, and kind of seen a lot that really the plurality of the informants come from middle class backgrounds. And so it was really encouraging me to see, there is a chance, and this time in the 20s is important. I think one of the key things in the book is it's important to develop a liberal arts approach to life. And really, something I'm thinking about now, as a 20-something, is kind of specializing and focusing on something, but also keeping a broad mindset and connections, because that's key to leadership later on.
Great, thank you. Bill Wichterman.
Thank you for your great comments today, and congratulations on your leadership at Gordon. A question for you really goes to the question of pride and humility and faithfulness. This is a town built on a lot of people clawing to the top and to step on others for leadership. Did you find anything in your leaders which indicated that these were people who were not seeking to be leaders, but instead their eyes were on the horizon, their eye was on the goal, and the leadership was a byproduct, or were these people trying to figure out how to lead?
It's a very perceptive observation. And I have to say that I did find that there were some people clawing their way up to the top. And there's certainly some examples. I'm not going to name any names tonight. But I also have to say that what I found is that there's a really distinct difference between those folks who occupied the very top strata of organizations and those who are the wannabes. And I found that those individuals who actually get to the top position, they tend to have a higher degree of personal humility, but a deeper degree of institutional pride. So, and that resonates with research that a variety of other folks have done, and I certainly found that to be the case in my work as well. That individuals who are really committed to making their life count and to make a difference, it didn't matter so much what their title was, and they weren't as focused on issues about authority. Now, there's some who were, but by and large, the majority of the folks, and certainly the platinum leaders that we talk about, they were individuals who seemed to, in many ways, be above that fray. They were really committed to trying to make their life count. They didn't want to waste opportunities. And I would say that there certainly have been times along the way when they probably took steps that maybe upon reflection didn't always reflect their values. Certainly the case. But on the whole, they tended to be individuals who who found themselves in opportunities. Now, part of it is that they got into the right networks. They were relational entrepreneurs. I mean, one of my favorite stories is Vernon Jordan, who in the book we found he is the most influential advisor to the business community alive today. At one time, Vernon Jordan served on 12 Fortune 500 CEO boards at the same time. And when I asked CEOs to name individuals whose counsel they sought, his name came up the most. So he's an extraordinary individual. Vernon Jordan says, I never applied for a job. I've never applied for a job in my life. Now, it helps that he's made friends in powerful places. But early on, he had a real commitment to a sense of calling and vision. If you know his story, he was involved in civil rights, went to go study with Dick Neustadt, who was a political scientist at Harvard, and that opened up a lot of doors. And I found that to be more often the case.
Other questions right back there.
My question's similar, actually. I'm Nat Nasworth. I write for the Christian Post, and it seems like almost every week we're writing about the failures of some evangelical leader, a pastor or the leader of an evangelical organization. And it seems like there's some common themes that I see in all these stories, and that is you're looking at people with humongous egos and little accountability in their organizations. And as I'm listening to you speak, I'm wondering, is that a problem that's unique to the evangelical world, or is that something that you see elsewhere with leaders?
Yeah, I don't think evangelicals have a corner on the market of moral failure or of lack of accountability. But I do think that there is something that is true within evangelical Christianity that is entrepreneurial. There's a lot of startup kind of organizations and startup churches. And within that entrepreneurial ethos, there tends not to be the same kind of institutional structures that create systems of accountability, which is why that we found institutions really do matter for long-term success. So one bit of advice that I give to young people who are graduating from Gordon who really want to lead well over the long haul is for them to develop a network of friends who they know from an early part of their career who can hold them accountable on some of the hard questions about life. I mean, truthfully, the things that get folks in trouble are quite common. It's sex, money, and power. And so you need friends who will ask you some of the hard questions. Are you being faithful in your marriage? How are you handling your finances? And who's keeping you grounded so that you don't begin to believe your own press? And I think that the people who I interviewed who had that platinum style of leadership, they have found ways in which individuals could hold them accountable. I mean, a wonderful story is a great guy named John Canis, who's a CEO of Bank United. And John has maintained friendships from high school. I mean, these are the folks who he vacations with, who he stays connected with, and they have a way of keeping him grounded. That kind of approach I found to be incredibly helpful. Regardless of your faith tradition, it's important to have accountability.
Up here in front.
Good evening. My name is Lisa Artuso. I'm a 2012 recent grad of Gordon College, and since moving to this...
Go Fighting Scots.
Exactly. Played field hockey for all of one season. As a young professional in international development who takes seriously both the power of decision makers and the distance between my office in DC and the places where we work, I was wondering if you could speak to the distance between those places of power and views that are not from the top. And as someone also very interested in institutional power and change, did you find any themes or suggestions for how we orient those institutions towards change that a Christian commitment or a commitment to all views would offer?
Yeah, so one of the things that we say in the book, which is an area for real critique for many of the leaders that we found, is their lack of attention, really a blind spot, of their awareness of how the issue of executive compensation, excessive executive compensation, significantly erodes their public trust. And I mean, it was striking. I interviewed one guy who said to me, I have no idea how much money I made last year. And I said, that's because you made so much, you stopped counting it. He made $37 million the year before. And the number of executives who were completely oblivious to how executive compensation becomes emblematic of their inability to connect with the experiences of ordinary Americans significantly diminishes their symbolic leadership. I did find some wonderful counterexamples who their stories have actually been galvanizing for other folks. So I'll just share one that happened a number of years ago that's been helpful for a number of business leaders. Max Dupree was the CEO of Herman Miller, the furniture company. Probably their most successful product is the Aeron chair. I highly recommend it. It's a very comfortable business chair. And Max had a regular practice of walking the factory floor at Herman Miller. One day, he was having a conversation with a guy who was working in the factory who didn't have a college degree, an older gentleman, who Max said he had never really been acculturated into the niceties of what you ask the CEO and what you don't ask the CEO. And he said somewhere in the conversation, the topic came up about compensation. And so this older gentleman just said, well, Max, how much money do you make? And he said, in that moment, I was embarrassed to answer him because I realized I couldn't really justify why my salary was so different from his. Historically, the average differential from the top employee to the lowest paid employee within a company is about 45 to 1. So if the lowest paid employee is paid $1,000 a year, the top paid employee is paid $45,000 a year. Max had done some research and learned that historically the differential had been about 20 to 1. And so he went to his board and said, I would like for us to cap my salary so that it is connected to be 20 times that of the lowest paid employee. Now you might say, well, he's being paid 20 times. Well, that's a whole lot better than the national average today, which is 150 to 1. So I did find some examples of folks who are willing to think about how their power and influence could be appropriately channeled and how they could put boundaries on their life to try and bridle things like compensation. But there are not enough examples of those. Perhaps you, as a Gordon graduate, will be able to lead the way going forward.
Question in the back there, Mark Epley.
Thank you so much. My name is Mark Epley. I was a class of '89 from Gordon, and it's a treat to hear from you. So I'm wondering, at any given time, we can't all be leaders, right? And at Gordon, not all the students there will be leaders in a particular field at a given time. Maybe leaders in their home and other places. And I think about, in raising my boys, what do I try to teach them about leadership? And I think the best message I give them is, guys, I want you to spot opportunities to do what's good and excellent and fun and life-affirming and those kinds of things, and encourage other people to do that. What is your interviews, your research over time taught you? What is it you tell that you teach your kids? What is it you teach the students generally about what it is they should aspire to? I think it's something about pursuing what's good, right, what's excellent, pure, perfect. But I'd be glad to hear what you learn generally. What do we all need to hear about leadership?
So I think one of the most important things to teach our kids and for us to live out day in and day out is that we really lead with our life. And so the way that we conduct ourselves makes a real difference. It's interesting because in the midst of doing this research, which took 10 years of my life, my wife and I had a daughter who ended up being a special needs child. And parenting Elizabeth has helped me to see an entirely different view of leadership and to understand what it means to have a life worth leading and to recognize that just because our society does have individuals who go on to occupy the pinnacles of power, that's not the calling for everyone. And I actually am not sure it's a healthy motivation for us to seek those kind of positions. Getting back to Bill's point, I think it's far more significant for us to develop within our sons and daughters a willingness to try and serve and to do things with excellence. And in my mind, that's what leadership is about. Excellence and service. And so we try to cultivate within our young people, within our kids, within our students at Gordon, that kind of a commitment. Recognizing that leadership occurs in lots of different settings. It doesn't require you to be the CEO of a Fortune 100 company. You actually can exercise very significant leadership as a classroom teacher, or as a coach, as a pastor, as a nurse. These are significant roles that have long-lasting impact. One of the things that we encountered over the course of the study is we wanted to see what were the most formative influences on these folks who go on to occupy really senior roles. And what we found is that it tended not to be people who were in those very powerful positions that were their mentors. Instead, it was folks who lived much humbler lives, but who then helped them get opportunities that made a real difference. I would imagine that all of us could say that in one way or another, we stand on the shoulders of giants, people who helped move us along, which include a variety of folks, not always the CEO, but folks who did indeed lead with their life.
Meredith Schultz.
I was wondering if you could provide any insights into how leaders respond well to failure, or perhaps how they don't.
Yeah, I think one of the things was a common question we asked was how leaders viewed decisions, whether they looked back on it a lot or struggled with it. And most said you just kind of have to put it behind you and move on. And I think being able, failure is a part of everyone's life, and being able to handle that well is a really key trait. Not every step is a step forward, and leadership, it's really key to be able to move on from failure.
Yeah. One of my favorite quotes was given by Thad Allen. He served as Commandant of the Coast Guard. And as it turned out, after the FEMA debacle in New Orleans, he was put in charge of the U.S. government's response to Hurricane Katrina. And then as it turned out, because he had developed so many significant relationships in New Orleans, the federal government asked him to be their point person when the BP Deepwater oil spill occurred. So he led sort of the U.S. government's response to two major crises that happened in New Orleans. And Thad's a rough and tumble kind of guy. He actually, I think, was arrested twice as an adult, got into some fights. So he helped me to learn that just because you can be a leader in one domain doesn't mean that you're going to be a leader in another domain. But he worked really, really well for the Coasties, for the Coast Guard. They loved him. And one of the things that Thad taught me is that when you are leading, you can't spend a lot of time in what he calls the regret locker. You have to move on. And I think that that's probably true. Every single person we interviewed experienced significant failure at some point in time. And in fact, we learned so much more about who we are and who we want to be in those moments of failure than we do in moments of success. But the difference between these folks and maybe ordinary Americans is that they have tremendous grit and persistence, and they bounce back. So they're willing to keep trying and going after it. I was struck, for example, when I studied the White House Fellowship, how many of the folks had been rejected the first time that they applied. So I tell people, if you get rejected, try again. You never know what might happen.
A bunch of hands. We'll start there.
Hi, my name is Mark Hannes. I'm a recent White House Fellow, so I appreciate the plug for the program. My question is, how over time has leadership at all changed when you see, like over 50 years is 2 generations? Because I think a big reason is millennials are often critiqued for not appreciating institutions, because sometimes we don't need to, because there's a lot more that's been democratized with technology. So I'm just curious how you've seen that leadership as the people you've interviewed changed, if at all.
One of the most amazing things to me is how you really have to be born to a certain time if you're going to have a certain kind of leadership profile. And if you look, take a longer view than say 50 years, but take a look of 500 years, what would constitute somebody as a leader in 1500 looks really different than what would constitute a leader in 2000. In 1500, you needed to be physically quite strong and be a warrior. That's what allowed folks to be seen as a leader. In 1700, it was education. Being somebody who was the most learned person in the community gave you gravitas that other people did not have, and so they deferred to your leadership. Today, the most important characteristic for leading is the ability to persuade. It's extraordinary how persuasion is the coin of the realm. And so your point about millennials is interesting, because while it is true that some millennials sort of don't like bureaucracy, they also are probably more committed to institution building than has been the case for 3 generations. They're more like their grandparents or their great-grandparents who are real builders of opportunity. And so one of the things that I'm sort of excited about is the entrepreneurial edge we see among millennials. They want to solve big problems, and they know to get that done, it's going to take an organization or an institution. So they're all about creating those. They have some interesting things to say about existing institutions, and I have to remind them that if you really want to reform something, you have to be an insider. Prophets may be able to make the headlines, but they're not going to be able to be the folks who make the real difference. You got to be an insider to make the change.
Several hands right up here. We'll start here.
Dr. Lindsay, thank you. Wes Goodman, one of the questions that I had was you talked a little bit about the importance of institutional connectivity and influence. How does that, do you think, butt up against what a lot of Americans are seeing now as the influence of cronyism in our politics and our leadership? That the people with the best, representation on K Street, the best memberships in trade associations, are able to get ahead while you see a lot of people in the rest of the country just sort of muddling by that don't have that sort of influence in Washington. How do you sort of square that to be a credible leader, an authentic leader, but still have that cachet in the country that you're not just sort of getting by based on your connections, based on the influence that you've been able to buy? You mentioned Vernon Jordan, who is successful largely because of his friendship with the Clintons, and maybe not because of anything other than that ability to persuade people that are powerful. How do you sort of square that ability to lead and be authentic with this sense I think we now have in the country that a lot of people are just getting by at the top because they know the right people and they know the right levers to turn?
Yeah, I have to say that when I look at the situation in Washington as a social scientist, I'm pretty discouraged. Because the partisan rancor and the way in which our political conversations have devolved over the last 20 years, I don't think have been healthy. And when I talk with our students, college students, they're very hopeful that they can make a change, but also quite discouraged about the structures that they see in place. It's interesting, just to sort of tweak a little bit what you said. I would have assumed that Vernon Jordan got to where he was because of Bill Clinton. Actually, Bill Clinton got to where he was because of Vernon Jordan. It was interesting because Vernon Jordan had been going to this conference called the Bilderberg Conference for a number of years. And it's sort of a power elite global organization, very selective. And he brought Bill Clinton to the Bilderberg Conference. And when he brought him, the organizers said, who is this guy from Arkansas? And Vernon Jordan said, he's going to be the next president of the United States. He brought him in 1991. Sure enough, Vernon Jordan helped create a lot of opportunity. The larger message, I think, about influence and how does it work, I think that there are some hopeful signs. I'm actually kind of encouraged with what we've seen with the digital revolution and how that has democratized opportunities for a lot of people to get voices in ways that we wouldn't have seen 25 years ago. I'm also encouraged by the number of sort of entrepreneurial initiatives that the younger generation is developing, where you're seeing a blurring of the nonprofit, for-profit line. So people are selling shoes because that can help build water wells in Africa, those kinds of things. But the partisanship of Washington and the role of big money is a place of real discouragement.
Right up here.
Hi, I'm Karen Getman, and I want to ask really both of you about the role of gender and race. You talked about view from the top with a particular institutional point of view, and you're saying it's more entrepreneurial. I'm wondering, is this only in the United States? Is it global? And really, what's the role for women? And where the interviews that you've had with women and people of color, where they're contributing to a different view of what is the top, and artists and musicians. Thank you.
So the study is focused on the United States. I think maybe there were just a couple leaders who were based internationally. So I don't have a lot of response for the global question, but regarding women, I think 10% of the study were women, and it was not for lack of trying. It was a major priority to interview women and to find senior leaders. It's just at this point, they're very hard to find. So they definitely do add a lot. I think they're still struggling with the second shift requirements of women, where women work both, spend a lot of time in the workplace, and then when they go home, they're responsible for household responsibilities as well. So that's still a barrier. But we're talking about relationships. I do think actually mentorship and other relationships are really key for women and minorities in making their way up the ladder. It's something current leaders can really do, is to seek out, and some in the study did, is to seek out women and minorities and really to help them move up the chain as a way to teach them the social cues and give them some of the advantages that they missed.
Yeah, one of the interesting paradoxes of the study, we worked so hard to get women into the study. As Mary Grace said, only about 10% of the respondents are women. Looking at sort of the wider data, that's about right for what we see nationally, whether we're talking about women CEOs or women college presidents or women heads of nonprofits. There are some industries where women have more leadership roles. Actually, in the entertainment sector, you see that some women are in leadership opportunities, and in higher education. But the paradox is that there is a segment of people who are part of what's been called the inner circle. There's a social scientist at Wharton at the University of Pennsylvania named Michael Lindsay, who studied what he calls the inner circle, where these are folks who are in multiple boards of directors. So you might be a director at General Electric and a director at IBM. And if you actually analyze it, what you found is that women and people of color are overrepresented in that inner circle. And part of it I think, started as tokenism. So every Fortune 500 company wanted to have a woman, and they didn't know who were the women to go to, so they all chose the same woman, and they began to spread it around. But you see that also happening with Latinos and with African Americans. That's changing a little bit, and there's more of a trickle-down effect, and so there are more opportunities today. But I'd say that probably the most significant finding about the gender divide relates to work-life balance. So I would ask the people in the study, how do you reconcile the challenge of being in this very demanding job with an enriching family life, and how do you manage that? 96% of the people I interviewed were married at the time I conducted the interview, which is unbelievable. Now, not all of them were first marriages, but there's something about leadership that is quite lonely and that craves companionship. Both men and women talked about the challenge of balancing a busy job with an enriching family life. But to a person, every single woman was far more anguished about that challenge. They felt considerable guilt and frustration, a desire for them to figure out how they could have done it better. Everything from managing childcare to caring for aging parents. There is within our culture still the norm that women carry the burden for caring for the family, and as a result, women leaders feel that pressure as well.
There was even a much lower percentage of women who were married and who had children than men, because they just they hadn't found time for both things in their lives.
Yep.
Okay, we're going to take two more questions. We'll start right there.
Hi, thank you. I'm Hope Foster Britt, 1986, Gordon grad.
Hi.
I'm curious to know in your book at all if you address other than economic and political leaders. My own personal example is within the Anglican Communion. Mm-hmm. Desperately contentious leadership at the moment. And I didn't know if you had addressed that at all within any of those sectors.
Yeah, we included a whole variety of different kinds of institutional leaders. So we included not just corporate or business leaders or entrepreneurs, leaders in science, technology, entertainment, arts, media, education, nonprofit life. We included in the arts performers, writers, directors, a whole range of folks. And in the end, it was a wonderful project because we were able to sort of look to see, are there significant differences in the experiences of these folks? Those who were leaders in the creative sectors tended to have slightly different paths. They tended to embody what Mary Grace was saying, this liberal arts approach to life more readily, which is that they were conversant on a whole range of issues, and they were able to sort of build connections in lots of different ways. We did look at religious leadership as well, and there we found that many of the sort of bureaucratic challenges that the corporate leaders experience are similar, just you put religious language around it. So conflict can be found in the church as well. Big news.
Oh, so many hands. We'll start right here.
Hi, my name is Lilia, and my question is to follow up on what you were saying about women in leadership. And my experience has been that women can get to the top, but many of them feel they sacrifice having children or a husband, or perhaps have had a failed marriage or marriages, more than two. Can you talk about whether you felt that men felt differently than women with respect to that?
As we were researching gender, I actually found there's been a lot of research, and we saw the interviews as well, about how men are feeling more need to be more or involved fathers. Like they said, oh, my dad would never have gone to all my soccer games, but I'm expected to go to every soccer game. And it is something I feel that's kind of, it does affect men more increasingly. There's kind of more expectation that they will do more things with the house or with the kids. I think something we saw, it is possible to have a high leadership position and to have a good family life, but you can't do anything else. No hobbies, no friends, you just have your family and your work, but that's really the only way to make it work. I think one thing we found that really helped people balance is if leaders prioritize rituals and routines. So if they make a ritual of, okay, every Sunday I'm going to make pancakes and I promise I'm going to be there, then kids think, oh yes, this is what it is to be a good father, is to have these pancakes on Saturday, and this is what it means. And so that was important. And also leaders can really change their, when you're at the top, you can set when the meetings are. So you can set the meeting around your kids' soccer game or recital and really use that as a way to stay connected with your family. So it is possible, it's just very difficult and there's not time for much else.
We'll take one more bonus question in the back there.
Hello, Michael. I was just wondering about the ones that got away. So you interviewed over 500, which is fantastic, over 10 years. But have you ever thought about the ones that got away and any commonalities amongst them and things that maybe we can learn from those that didn't want to share their leadership secrets?
The commonality is that they were extremely good at being elusive, because I worked pretty hard. Probably the biggest fish that got away was President Clinton. I did have the opportunity to interview President Bush and President Carter, and I really wanted to interview Bill Clinton, and worked pretty hard and was relatively close a couple of times that ended up falling through, and I always regretted that. You know, one of the things that I think after I got to a place of having done 200 or 300 of these interviews, I have to say the number of new ideas that I was encountering wasn't that great. But I had set a goal, because the largest interview-based study that had ever been done was by a team of researchers at Columbia University called the American Leadership Study. And they interviewed 545 people. So by golly, I was going to do 546. And the funniest story is that I was in the midst of doing this research, and while doing it, it was January of 2011, and one night I was getting into bed and I turned to my wife, Rebecca, and I said, you know, I've been working on this project for like 7 years, and I still have about 90 interviews to reach that 550 goal. But I think that I might actually get this opportunity to go and serve at Gordon College, and I just don't know how I would be able to do both of those, and I don't know how actually I would be able to even finish this study. And she sort of sat up in bed and she said, well, you're gonna. So you know who the leader is in our household. And I'm very happy to say that I worked hard at it, and 2 weeks after starting the job at Gordon, I did my 550th interview, It was Drew Faust, the president of Harvard, which I thought was a nice conclusion. It's an amazing study, and I do hope that you enjoy the book. I hope you buy the book and share with other folks. Thanks so much for coming tonight.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Mary Grace. If you did not have a chance to ask your question, fear not. There is still opportunity to do so, either on our Facebook page or on our Twitter feed at hashtag Trinity Forum or hashtag View from the Top, where you can offer your comment, your question, or your insight, and we encourage you to do so. Also, tomorrow we'll be posting photos from the event, so we encourage you to log on, tag your friends, add a comment, and so on. All of you should have on your seat an invitation to join the Trinity Forum Society, and we hope very much that you will avail yourself of this opportunity tonight. Events like this are not possible without the regular support of our members and donors, and if you have enjoyed tonight's event, if you have benefited from it, I encourage you to join the Trinity Forum Society and make events like this possible for others as well. As a special incentive to join the Trinity Forum Society tonight, if you do so, we will give you a free copy of Michael Lindsay's View from the Top. As well as our subscription to quarterly readings like Long Walk to Freedom, which just came out this spring, and many other opportunities as well. So we hope you'll avail themselves of that opportunity, not only to make programs like this possible, but also to be part of a community of people who want to engage those big questions of life and do it together. In addition, if you are interested in becoming a Trinity Forum Academy Fellow, like the stalwart Mary Grace Hager, we encourage you to think about that. There are several people in the audience that you can talk to. Bob Kramer, if you could raise your hand, Beth Chapman, either of them can talk to you about how to do this. And finally, I think it is only appropriate to end with thanks, and there are many people to thank this evening. We very much appreciate our speakers and the insights that you have brought. So appreciate Gordon College being willing to sponsor this event with us and the staff there. I'd also like to just thank my own incredibly competent, excellent staff who do their jobs often in silence and obscurity, but also always with excellence and even panache. Rebecca Good, Margaret Eberly, Chloe Cuffle, and Elias Brockman, thank you very much. Absolutely. Thank you also to volunteers Capri Bell and Rebecca Nabel, who have volunteered multiple times. We so appreciate your work. I should add that Michael will be at the registration table right out back, where we will be selling, and he will be signing copies of his work, and encourage you to do that. In addition, the bar will be open after we leave. Thank you for coming, and good night.